a fascinating presentation or set of presentations from Professor Helen Margetts and also Bertie Vidgen. Helen Margetts is the program director for the Turing's public policy program and also a professor at the University of Oxford. She and Bertie are going to present together and hand over to one another, and then we will have a Q&A session for 20 minutes at the end. I'm afraid we will have to finish bang on time because Helen's off to the Houses of Parliament after our session here this evening, but Bertie can stay. Bertie's a postdoctoral researcher at the Alan Turing Institute, and there is a Meet the Speaker point just through the white doors at the back. So if we don't cover all of the questions that you would like to have answered in the formal session, we can cover them there. So the subject of the presentation is countering online hate with advanced computational methods, and I'm certain you're going to enjoy it. Let me hand over now to Helen and Bertie.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. So, I'm the director of the Public Policy Programme at the Alan Turing Institute, which launched just over a year ago. And what we do in that programme is we try and think of ways that, and work with policymakers to use data science and artificial intelligence to make better public policy, to improve the provision of public services, to do more efficient resource allocations, and to tackle long-running policy problems. And that's where hate speech comes in, because I feel sure that there's not going to be anyone who would disagree that the phenomenon of online hate speech on digital platforms is a problem, and a growing problem, and one that needs tackling. That's the idea of this project, Hate Speech Measures and Countermeasures. Bertie is the lead researcher on this program. I'm showing that just to show that we have a very multidisciplinary team. We don't believe, I'm a political scientist, so's Bertie, but two of these are computer scientists and public policy researchers. We don't believe you can look at a problem like hate speech without incorporating expertise from the social sciences as well as from computer science and more technical or quantitative disciplines. So we're bringing those together. We're using social science lines of inquiry and posing social questions. We're using machine learning, and we're doing machine learning and developing techniques. And we're planning to design policy interventions so that we can work to counter hate speech as well as just to analyze it. We have a sister project called The Misinformed Citizen. That's because I think there's a tendency when we think about hate speech to think about kind of binary hate or not hate. Is it hate or is it not hate? But actually there's a spectrum which goes, a pretty horrible spectrum that goes all the way from death threats and rape threats and kind of a clear link to physical violence or threats, right the way to offensive behavior, and finally to kind of news stories that have some element of hate in them but are difficult to pin down. And we want to capture that whole spectrum and try and develop ways of measuring so that we have classifiers that actually measure whether something is kind of deep hate, if you like, or some kind of offensive behavior. I said hate speech is a problem. It's something that, particularly if you enter any kind of public life, you are likely to experience in some way or another. Here, for example, is the UKIP, and until recently, European elections candidate who posted this on Twitter: "I wouldn't even rape you, Jess Phillips." That's the kind of message that members of parliament in particular, but really any women who enter public life, are confronted with over and over again. I'm sure that you will agree that that is a problem, just that is a problem, and there are all sorts of similar problems. Most people also agree that it requires some sort of policy response. You may have heard about the white paper produced by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport back in April, which discusses ways in which we might deal, for example, the possibility of a new regulator of online harm in general, but also hate speech in particular, including, in fact, this project. There's a little box about it in the white paper. What that indicates, the production of that white paper, is, first of all, that policymakers realize this is a problem that needs tackling, a policy problem, and also that it needs kind of, at the moment, content moderation policy, and any attempts to tackle hate speech are really driven by digital platforms themselves. It's really, at the moment, Facebook or Twitter or some other platform that decides what you see, not policymakers or any kind of institution. And that's something we need to think about, and policymakers are thinking about. We're also seeing a rather welcome recognition from policymakers that we need more research. You know how it is, the academics among you will know that usually it's us academics saying, we need more research money. But actually, we are seeing policymakers say this also, that we've got a real kind of paucity in the evidence base, that we need more understanding of hate speech and what the effects of it are and how it is changing our civic discourse and public life. And even the scale and scope and nature of the problem, we don't actually know that much about. And certainly, you need to know those things before you can hope to design any sort of intervention. I should point out now that I'm going to sort of confuse you and make you anxious and tell you all the questions that we need to be tackling in hate speech research. Bertie, however, just to comfort you, is going to show you some of the things that we're already doing and that we've already done to kind of answer some of these questions. So just bear with me for a moment. One of the things that we don't really know about is what is hate? What is online abuse? What makes something hate and not hate? Is it abuse directed at another person, an individual? Is that the only thing that counts as hate? Or is it hate directed at some group or another? Is it racism or sexism or anti-Semitism directed at a whole group and category of people? Or is it both? Or is it either or? And then there's the question of legal definitions. The legal definitions in the UK in particular are very, very narrow. The police have a very narrow definition of hate speech. And there are many instances of the law being totally unable to cope with the idea of hate speech. One of the possible kind of legal definitions of a hate speech contravention is an abuse of public order. But to do that, given that you can argue that for hate speech you've actually been sitting on your own house, you can't be convicted of a public order offence. So there's kind of real contradictions in the actual legal context of hate speech. And there's also questions of freedom of expression. My hate that seems of real concern to me may not be of concern to you. And some people believe that any hate should be left sort of untrammeled on the internet. To stop it is some kind of censorship or restriction of freedom of speech. So people have very different views as to what should be allowed and what shouldn't. Here's another thing we don't know. How much online hate is there, really? I'm saying it's a problem, but how much is there? We really don't know that. There's a very kind of vague estimate there that it's kind of less than 1% of all content. But if somebody tells you a figure like that, they're telling you perhaps a very, very rough rough estimate of one platform at one particular time. It's not going to be some kind of comprehensive answer that you can really kind of use in any meaningful way. There's an interesting statistic that over a quarter of people have seen some sort of hateful or cruel comments or images posted online. That's from very preliminary findings, I've been told to say that, from the Oxford Internet Survey that we produce in Oxford. So you can see even a small amount, what seems like a very small amount of hate speech has potentially a big effect if that kind of volume of people are actually seeing it. What effect does it have on the people who've said it? Some people have argued, for example, Laura Bates, who set up the Everyday Sexism platform, some people have argued that hate speech threatens to kind of discourage a whole generation of women, for example, from entering public life. Those comments, those comments about Jess Phillips, for example, and the hate that's directed at any woman who enters the public stage. That embedded in that question is a whole number of other questions. How do we classify or measure misogynistic hate in comparison with other sorts of hate? We need a different sort of classifier, but often people treat them the same. What's the effect on the target, on the members of parliament, for example, who are targeted? What's the effect on the people who see it, even if they're not in the debate? Does online interaction actually reinforce prejudice? How organized is hate against women? Is it a kind of casual thing that people used to maybe think in their darkened bedrooms, but not actually communicating with each other? Or is it, as some people have suggested, an organized network that are coordinating their efforts? Those are very different phenomenon and would also require very different interventions. And what's the link, of course, with real physical violence? What is the link between online hate and physical violence? I'm segueing into solutions here and kind of the kind of ways that we're going to tackle these things, but I do have to mention these kind of endemic challenges to answering questions about hate speech. And they fall, as many of the challenges to using data-intensive technologies to tackle policy problems, into sort of two columns: the ethical and legal questions about researching hate speech, and then the technical ones. So on the ethical side, we have, for example, if you're talking about collecting data that contains a lot of abusive content about people, what are the ethics of doing that? What kind of privacy concerns might you be violating? I mentioned freedom of speech. There are questions of algorithmic bias. If we're using classifiers to identify hate speech, do they work better for certain sorts of targets of hate speech than others? We know that many things like facial recognition technology have worked better on certain groups of people and have been trained on certain groups of people. That's something we've got to look out for. Can countermeasures actually be ethical interventions into discussions online, for example? Some kind of automated counter bot. Is that an ethical thing to produce if you can't be sure you can control it? These are quite profound ethical questions. Where do we need legal change? I mentioned that. There's all sorts of questions about where we need legal change and who should decide what kind of content is allowed to stay in the public sphere and what isn't. And then technical questions. Bertie will talk more about these, but the question of irony and sarcasm, how do you distinguish that linguistically from hate? What do you do about images and videos and audio? We tend to focus on text. And a real question here is one of data availability, because we see a great deal of research of hate on hate speech on Twitter. Well, of course, Twitter is good for hate. There's plenty of hate there. I'm sure most of you know that. But it's because the data is available that people tend to study it. We see far, far less studies of Facebook or WhatsApp or Instagram and so on, because we don't have the data. It's locked in proprietary platforms. So the aim of this project is to basically overcome these challenges, or some of these challenges, and build an evidence base for policy intervention. We want to look at multiple platforms, not just stick to the ones where data is very easily available. We want to look at the full spectrum of hate, not binary. We want to look at multiple targets and make some comparisons. We want to do that in a multidisciplinary way. We want to move beyond the kind of arsenal of pilots and one-off tools. There's actually thousands of research projects on hate speech, but they tend to be kind of building one tool for one platform at one time for one sort of hate. And then that's done, let's do something else now. So we want to do some synthesis and to understand what's useful. And all those tools tend to be based on a very small number of data sets. There's around about 25 data sets that's used by thousands of projects. So let's think about that and think about getting hold of more data. And then, of course, thinking about policy interventions, that's very important, and that's something that many tools, the development of tools is not really geared towards thinking about policy. So that's the idea, that's the ultimate dream. Perhaps you might think too much of a dream, but we want to work out new ways and synthesize ways of detecting hate, of understanding it and its effect, and then responding to it. These are what we're working on kind of straight away. These are our kind of immediate next steps. A kind of systematic review of all those thousands of projects that have already taken place, and identifying the kind of classifiers and data sets that could be taken forward. We want to build a platform for integrating previous work into a sort of a tool that's useful for researchers. And we're collaborating with policymakers from DCMS and the Home Office. So now I'm going to hand over to Bertie, who's going to talk about some of the research that he and we have been doing and how we might apply that in the future. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Helen, for that excellent overview of some of the challenges of studying hate online and what we're trying to do in our project. So I'm going to talk about some research that we've done at the Oxford Internet Institute with our colleague, Dr. Taha Yassiri, where we looked at Islamophobia on Twitter. So sadly, I'm not managing to overcome that challenge of single platforms, single types of hate, but we're going to use this as a launchpad for more research in the future. So, a bit of a background about Islamophobia. I mean, Islamophobia is a very harmful type of behavior, whether that's speech, physical attacks, organized movements. It not only causes harm to the targeted individuals, but also the communities of which they're part of. And of course, when Muslims are excluded from public life, I think we all lose out from that. In a UK context, when we talk about Islamophobia, we're really talking about one of two things. The organized, directed, targeted, very overt hate that we see from Tommy Robinson and other far-right actors, and then the everyday, more subtle, but still very insidious types of hate that Baroness Barcy has been drawing attention to. I'm just going to maybe wait a moment. Perfect. But of course, it's not all doom and gloom, because there's actually a lot of great organizations working in this place trying to challenge Islamophobia. So there's the APPG on British Muslims. That started last year. They've been doing some great work trying to get a definition of Islamophobia used across society. The Runnymede Trust, they actually introduced the notion of Islamophobia to UK discourse, and then charities such as MEND and Tal Mama. So what did we try to do? We wanted to look at the dynamics of Islamophobia on Twitter And to do that, we wanted to integrate qualitative and quantitative methods. I think one of the big research challenges in this space is that there's some very good qualitative research. So people who perhaps look at a single website, a single forum, they do a close reading of a very in-depth piece of research. There are then other people, as we've talked about earlier, who use machine learning to do things at scale and in a very quantitative way. But our goal was to try and integrate those two aspects together in a way that was theoretically sound. So we started off by looking at what is Islamophobia, which is a qualitative piece of work, where we went through about 20,000 tweets. We then moved into using those insights to do some machine learning so that we could apply it at scale to our full data set, and then we did quantitative analysis to understand the user dynamics. So this is the definition of online Islamophobic content that we've used in this work. Now, any definition obviously has lots of limitations. This was appropriate for us for the data set that we looked at. And we said that Islamophobia is content that expresses indiscriminate negativity against Islam or Muslims. And then we distinguish between strong and weak forms. So strong is when it's very explicit. That's the kind of direct, overt hate that we see from Tommy Robinson and other far-right actors normally. And then weak Islamophobia is when it's implicit. It's slightly harder to identify, and that makes it slightly harder to challenge. So we don't want to draw any kind of moral hierarchy here. This is more an analytical distinction between how explicit the hatred is. So, fortunately, there have been a lot of advances in machine learning over the last 5 years, which means that our ability to detect Islamophobia has improved. I'm going to talk very quickly about sort of 4 of the most important advances. So, first of all, dependency parsing. This is a way of identifying the syntax from sentences. So we can actually work out how words are related to each other and then work out long-term dependencies through sentences and through conversations online. Semantic analysis, so looking at word embeddings, we can start to actually relate the meaning of words in a very dense, powerful way. Improved architectures of algorithms, so we have ensemble machine learning. So instead of just using one algorithm, which may have a whole load of biases, we can use multiple, combine them together to get a result. And then finally, transfer learning, which is probably one of the most exciting areas in this space, where we can use very large data sets which have been trained on, tools which have been trained on very large data sets and then apply them to ours, but optimize them so that they're actually relevant for the tasks that we're trying to achieve. So what did we do to detect weak and strong Islamophobia? We had a 4-step process. First of all, we made a training data set, which was about 4,000 tweets, and we had 3 experts annotate that content for whether it's weak Islamophobic, strong, or none. We then extracted features from our data set, and we trained a new word embeddings model. We then fed that into an algorithm, which was a support vector machine, and then we tested and trained the results to make sure that we could actually apply it at scale. I say this process, when you sort of write it out, it looks quite simple, but in practice we had to go back and forth a lot of times between the different stages. Certainly for making the training data set was a huge piece of work, and the annotation guidelines we developed are now available online, and we'd encourage anyone else to use them and build on them further. But there are lots of technical challenges and limitations, and I think increasingly from doing this work we recognize that any tool that you develop has some limitations. So the long-range dependencies, and a great example of that is if someone posts a tweet about Muslims or about Muslims in British life, someone else replies to that tweet. If you don't have the original tweet and the context of their reply, you might not be able to make sense of it. So if someone says, yes, they're a problem, we should do something about them, if you don't know the original tweet, you won't identify that as Islamophobia. Multimedia, our model was based around text, but of course there's a lot of videos and images, and that has to be taken into account. Adversarial content, which I think Helen briefly showed, that's where users know that we're trying to detect hate. So they do things to get around those detection methodologies. I won't go into what they all are, because obviously that's a bit problematic, but there's a lot of ways that you can manipulate your content so you get around the classification schemas. And then counter-speech. So when people might post hateful content, but not because they support it or because they're being hateful, but to draw attention to it and to challenge it. There's a very good chance that the tools we have at the moment will still detect that as hate. So, So we've talked about the concept of Islamophobia, the machine learning we did, and now on to the interesting part, or the most interesting part, which is the quantitative analysis of the dynamics. So we collected a new data set of the BNP. For anyone who's not familiar with the BNP, they're a far-right party in the UK. About 10 years ago, they had a major breakthrough. They had 2 MEPs elected, they had a London Assembly member elected, and they took control of a council in London. And this was huge news in the UK political landscape, given that we've always been seen as a country which doesn't have a far right. And they sort of sadly proved that to be wrong. So we collected all the followers of the BNP. There's about 15,000, but then we filtered them down to make sure that we were actually looking at people who had some support for the BNP. So we got rid of anyone who wasn't tweeting in English, anyone who was a bot, anyone who followed another political party, just because you can't be sure really where their allegiance lies, and we had about 6,500 users. Over the 1 year that we collected data for, we had 5 million tweets. So, very basic question that Helen was posing earlier, how prevalent is Islamophobia? So in our data set, we had 84% was not Islamophobic, 16% was, and that breaks down into 11% weak and 5% strong. Now I would caution that we really can't generalize from these figures, because these are of course some of the most Islamophobic people on the web. This was a period, if you look at the dates, March 2017 to 18, when there was a lot of Islamist terror attacks, and we know that's a driver of Islamophobia. And also there's some classification error, so we know that our classifier picks up on anti-immigrant sentiment, sometimes as Islamophobia. But that gives us our headline answer to that question. But we also want to understand which users are most responsible for Islamophobia. So on this graph, each dot is a different user. The x-axis shows the number of tweets they send, the y-axis shows the number of tweets which are Islamophobic, and the axes are logarithmic. So they go 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. I think there's 2 main things to take away from this plot. First of all is that the scaling factor is superlinear. So the more tweets you send, the more likely you are to send Islamophobic tweets. And secondly, we can see that a small number of users are actually responsible for most of the Islamophobia. So the Gini coefficient, for anyone who's interested in that, is about 0.88. So actually it's a very small number of users who send most of the hateful content. Now the problem that we had with the previous graph is that that's a snapshot of data. We've taken a whole year of behavior and we've put each user down to a single dot. So we wanted to try and understand the dynamics over time. Now, this looks quite messy. So what do all of these different dots mean? Well, each row is a different user. We then took our year of data and split it into 10 time periods. So there's 10 dots. And then the colors reflect what we saw earlier. So light blue means no Islamophobia. Purple means weak. Red means strong. So we can see for each user in each time period, what is the strength of Islamophobia that they expressed. And this is the problem. This kind of graph is very hard to interpret. We have to have some way of clustering these users together to make more sense of the trajectories and the dynamics. Luckily, there's a very good method for doing that. It's called latent Markov modeling. And from that, we're able to identify distinct trajectories of Islamophobia. So again, the results here are the same. So there's 10 dots in each box according to the 10 time periods. We took every user who was assigned to each of the 6 states, and then we took the average behavior for each time period. So for example, in casual, we can see that in each time period, users are mostly not sending any Islamophobia, but they every so often might send a couple of weekly Islamophobic tweets. And so this gives us a much more nuanced view of what's actually happening online. There are some users who are casually Islamophobic, there are some users who are extremely Islamophobic. Nearly everything they send is hateful, and over the whole time period, that stays quite constant. But then there are other users where we can identify escalating and de-escalating trajectories. And this is very important from a policy perspective, because we might be able to identify intervention points before people escalate fully to extreme Islamophobia, And we might also be able to speak to the people who are de-escalating and work out why that is and what it was that motivated them to change their behavior. And of course, those trajectories are not all equal. So we see that about a third of users never engage in Islamophobia, about a third are the sort of casually Islamophobic, and then the remaining third are across the different classes. So actually, the thing which I found most surprising about this is the 15% who are extreme. And I found that surprising because I thought it would be much higher. I thought if you're looking at the far right, you're looking at the most hateful people online, you would expect a very large proportion of them to be constantly hateful. But actually what we see is, overwhelmingly, they're either not Islamophobic or infrequently Islamophobic. So I think this tells us something about the nature of how hate is expressed online. Now, just to contextualize this result, we did a very similar piece of analysis for some other political parties. Sadly, that's not quite as high quality as I'd hoped, but the idea is that each dot is a different user. The 4 parties we have are Conservatives, Labour, UKIP, and the BNP. So for those 4 parties, we took a sample of their followers and did the exact same analysis, and we calculated the probability that their tweets would be Islamophobic, which is shown on the y-axis. So the higher up the dots are, the more likely it is that their tweets will be Islamophobic. The size of the dots, which is admittedly a little bit hard to see, tells you how many tweets they sent. And the key finding from this is that Conservatives and Labour are very similar. So for all of the media discourse around Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, our results show that their social media followers are no different to those of Labour. The BNP, as expected, is far more Islamophobic, and UKIP sits somewhere in between, so we characterise it as a halfway house. I would caution that this data is from 2017, and since then the party has undergone a few changes, so that might have changed. And of course, what's also important is that within Conservatives and Labour, we still have people who are very Islamophobic. We still have people who would be right at home in a far-right party based on this particular type of measurement and this data set. So for us, it kind of showed that hate is actually very heterogeneous in the way it manifests across society. So some of the key findings from this empirical analysis is that a few users are responsible for most of the hate we see, but users are also very heterogeneous, and just taking the total number of Islamophobic tweets they send is not enough to really understand their behavior. The landscape of hate is very complex, so you can't characterize the BNP with just a single account. They actually have very different dynamics, and you also can't do that for the mainstream parties. And we found that computational tools, provided they're used in a sort of socially scientific, very aware manner, can provide a lot of new insight. So thank you very much for listening. Here's our email addresses if you'd like to follow up with us about anything which we've talked about, and I think now we're going to take questions. Yes. Thank you.
Would you like to go on stage? Ben, Helen, thank you. That was amazing. I'm sure that in the 25 minutes we've got left, you'll be bombarded with questions, but yours was the first hand to go up, so we'll take yours first of all.
Hi, my name is Adam Sawhill. I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, but I've also worked in tech as a programmer. Now, I know someone called Henry Story at Southampton. He's someone who's nearly as old as me, and he's doing a PhD in fake news and how to identify it. And following some of the exchanges on Twitter, I think I have come to the conclusion that, in fact, it's impossible, logically impossible, to work out what is fake news. I don't think you'd be pleased with this conclusion. What does this mean? It means that it's down to us to work out what is fake news. And of course, fake news, the idea of fake news overlaps with hate speech. It's down to us. You're not going to get an AI entity to work out what is hate speech, per se, I would say. It's down to us. Now, okay, so I just wanted to make another point, which, what I noticed, sorry, I know I'm taking some time, is that you're not talking about envy and hatred. Melanie Klein, very important psychoanalysts, and their understanding of where hatred fits into the development of the infant, which could be important for understanding how to intervene in this. So there's a sort of an open question.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. Well, yeah, thanks for that. I think you're definitely right that we can't look to AI to just give us an answer. And I think one of the things we've learned is that the machine learning tools are maybe not pure representations of social values, but they do encode and embed social values in them. And so we need to actively try to develop machine learning tools based on what we think is right to study and how we want to study it, and that is a social choice. I personally wouldn't agree that it's logically impossible to define fake news. I think it is a very tricky notion, because what do we mean by true news? But I wouldn't want to slip into relativism and just start saying, well, that means we can't at all arbitrate the quality of news. I think that's equally problematic. Regarding the other theories that you mentioned, that's not something I'm personally particularly familiar with. But yeah, I think this is one piece of research or one approach to developing interventions which will be used alongside a lot of other evidence bases. But we know that this type of research hasn't been integrated into government responses yet. So that's kind of why we think it's important.
Yeah, just one thing I'd add there would be this question of, I think this comes back to this idea of moving away from a binary definition, and that would apply to fake news as well, or anything really. If you try and say whether something is a democracy or not a democracy, then that becomes very, very difficult. But you can talk about something being more or less democratic on different indicators, and I think you could do that for concepts like hate speech and fake news, and that's what we're trying to do. With regard to using psychoanalytic theories, well, nothing's off the table, but some things are very, very difficult to research with the kind of data we're likely to have. And I think we have to accept that may be one of the most difficult.
Well, hello. Yeah, that was really interesting. I was wondering, so there's been a lot of discussion in the last while about the extent to which maybe political groups, political actors have been using messaging that is perhaps problematic or just general hate speech, maybe not as extreme as the BNP, but other parties or groups. Are there any platforms or systems that you can think of that enable people to kind of track and map what people are saying on social media in aggregate as campaigns? Obviously, you have this particular research you've done on hate speech, but I wonder if there's any system you have that's kind of aggregating different types of messaging for you before you then analyzing it as hate speech or not.
Well, I'll pass to Bertie to see if he does. I don't. One of the problems that perhaps we didn't talk about is that a lot of hate speech is taken down. Facebook took over 500 million accounts down in the first quarter of last year. And obviously we don't see that. Obviously we would really like to have access to that sort of data, but we don't. So it's kind of developing methods to capture data in real time is important, because otherwise it's gone. And any sort of aggregator, I think, would have the problem that you can't leave it sitting around sometimes if it is clearly in contravention of platform standards or illegal.
Yeah, that's right. And we also don't know how much content's seen which is hateful, because lots of platforms don't just take stuff down, they might make content less visible, they might add a sort of a sensitivity warning. And so actually learning the impact of hateful content is incredibly difficult. I'd say in terms of aggregate data sets, that's something which is being explored, because there are also now GDPR constraints around holding lots of data. Platforms generally tend to make it very difficult to share data. So Twitter only lets you share IDs of tweets, not the actual tweets themselves, and you can only share up to 50,000 a day, which when you get to quite big research projects means that you can only share a very small chunk of your data anyway. So actually those kind of tools would be ideal, but I don't see them happening anytime soon, if I'm being honest.
Hi. I'm quite interested in your research process. Defining things is very difficult, so I'm just interested to see how the process you went into defining Islamophobia for your team. Like who led it, who do you talk to, what did you research to come up with that?
Right, so that was through a close reading of tweets. And that was primarily by me, on my own, I'd say initially. And then to build out the guidelines, I worked with some other people who had worked on prejudice studies and hate speech and populism across Europe. And we built out the annotation guidelines to kind of take into account the practicalities of studying that data. And what does it mean in practice when you say, oh, it's indiscriminate negativity? You know, what does that actually mean when you see it? And I think the guidelines are where you get the real detail. I also subsequently did some work with the charity MEND and also the APPG on British Muslims, just to kind of sense check that what we were saying aligns, at least in some way, with the experiences of Muslims who have experienced hate speech. And I think going forward, that's really important, is to put victims and communities of this kind of content at the center of research rather than perhaps as an add-on at the end.
Hi there. One of the drivers of hate speech is radicalization. Have you looked at how social media platforms are driving radicalization? Have you got any hypotheses or theories on that?
So do you mean radicalization in the far right or in other areas?
Well, related to Islamophobia, you get into your filter bubble, you start thinking these things. What's the nature of how people get into the method, into that state where they want to be spreading hate speech? Have you looked at that?
Not, I mean, we do actually have a separate project on radicalization and extremism, but no, I mean, because we're never really going to have data to be able to follow kind of the people doing the hating all over the internet and comparing with other influences. We're never going to have that sort of data. What I hope we might do, although it will be later on in the project, is to look at this question of the extent to which it's organized and the extent to which there are kind of concerted campaigns against people which we could expect to have a different influence from just kind of casual hatred. There's some evidence. I mean, member of our research team was actually on the was actually on a project which is geared at kind of cleaning up one of the major platforms, and there was a press release about that, and they immediately received what looked like incredibly organized kind of campaign of hate against them, and I think that's a very important question, but sorry, it's not exactly what you're looking for.
Hi. You indicated to policies that might be put in place when people are migrating from kind of mild hate speech to more extreme hate speech. How would you think your data could possibly be used in those kind of policies? Would people need to be constantly monitored? And you know, especially taking into account the problems of, you know, the counter speech you were talking about and other platforms where people have legitimate grievances, like especially when, you know, the Southern Poverty Law Center labeled like Majid Nawaz, who is a practicing Muslim, a anti-Islamic extremist. How would people be monitored in this way, and would the government be needing your data to do that?
Yeah, that's a really big challenge in this space, and that's actually one of the issues around privacy, is that we might end up monitoring individuals who actually haven't done anything illegal. They haven't maybe even contravened the community guidelines of the platform that they're on, but we're monitoring them because we're worried that they might be at risk of doing something harmful. And I think in that case, we have to be very sure that we're balancing up their right to privacy against the potential harms they might cause. And this is actually where we could really do some research into the link between online behavior and offline. because that, I think, would give us more insight into the true extent of the harm and the risk that we're seeing here. I mean, this is something which came up in the DCMS white paper about online harms, is the need to proactively monitor social media. And I think it's still being discussed as to whether that's a good thing or not. My personal view is that there's certain types of content that we should be proactively monitoring for. I think there are certain things like very vicious threats, like where people have a real fear for their lives and for their well-being and their safety, that we should be proactively monitoring that, taking it down, and seeing whether there's other interventions we can do for those individuals. But we have to be very careful whenever implementing that.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it is a very difficult sort of technical problem here, and there isn't consensus on how to do it. One thing to consider is that the platforms themselves have no kind of magic bullet here. And one of the ways that our research like this might be used is to kind of look for possible, I don't know, algorithmic bias or something in what the platforms themselves are doing. Facebook, for example, recognized that they only capture about 50% of hate, and that's up from what it was a year or so ago. And that's far, far lower than other sorts of harmful behavior. So that's another area where we might think about the use of our data, because at the moment it's them driving what is hateful in quite a non-transparent sort of way. And this would kind of open up a bit those processes.
Hi. I'm building a Q&A, sorry, I'm here. Building a Q&A site for opinion at the moment, and I've seen an API called Perspective, which ranks comments as you type them on toxicity. And I was wondering, have you got something similar, like a real-time API that sort of ranks the hatred in a comment, but then this allows you to sort of stop a comment before it even gets posted? But if you actually, potentially if you offered one, I mean, I'd be happy to use it, but if you offered one, you could actually collect data before it's posted. That'd be a way for you to collect data, I was wondering.
I'm not familiar with it, perhaps Bertie is, but I mean, one issue there is this question of different sorts of hate and the importance of context in discerning it's very difficult to have a sort of generalized measure of toxicity, because different classifiers are needed for different sorts of hate depending on the target or whatever. So yeah, I mean, it might work for users who are worried about it being toxic, but most of the people who perpetrate hate speech are generally, that's kind of what they're looking for.
Yeah. So we are, in September, we're starting a project where we will be looking at all the classifiers and data sets available and trying to combine them to make a tool which could be used more widely. I don't think we have at the moment plans to make it available in real time, because there's quite a lot of infrastructure that has to go into that. The Toxicity API, or the Perspective API, the Toxicity classifier, is a really good tool, but there are some biases and limitations to it, precisely because they try to just say, look, we're going to get everything that's toxic. One of the big limitations, which has been shown in a lot of research, it's really bad with what we call adversarial content. You add a couple of spaces between the words, you change an S to a $sign, you do any of these things, and suddenly it can't pick up on it anymore. So it's a great tool, and I think it's a really good contribution, but it's still not that silver bullet to solving this problem.
Sorry, yeah. At the beginning of the talk, you talked about legislation being archaic and somewhat non-applicable in the context of hate speech on the online sphere. But Sarkon of Arcad, the fellow that you showed up there, he was intervened on with Section 127 of the Communications Act, which is quite widely drafted. Would you not say maybe that the legislation, there's been a resistance to apply what's already there in terms of existing legislation, rather than needing a whole format of new forms of hate speech legislation?
I mean, that's a good point, and quite often things are, you know, death threats and rape threats are illegal, and the hate crime and incitement to hatred are are illegal, and yeah, in that sense, you're right. But I think there's still quite, I mean, and also, sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. The question of a regulator, for example, I would argue against the need for a kind of new regulator to look at this, because all the regulators are developing kind of expertise in this space, and we could probably tackle it with the regulators we already have. But I think there definitely are places where the law needs to be changed. I mentioned one of them. I don't know.
No, I agree with that. The law could be better used that we currently have, but it definitely needs to be updated. And that particular act prohibits gross offensiveness. And of course, that raises the question of grossly offensive for who? And also, where's the line between offensiveness and jokes and satire? And it actually has been misapplied in the sense of prohibiting stuff that's clearly not offensive and is clearly joking, especially in the early days. So that law needs a lot more clarity around what it relates to, and it needs to be, I think, updated and used in a more rigorous way. But yeah, that could be a good act that could be used.
Hi, I'm Michael Willoughby. I'm a marketing writer for tech companies. I wanted to hear a bit more about was it deceleration or de-escalation?
De-escalation.
And the intervention, which you sort of tantalizingly touched on there. Could you talk a bit more about what that looks like, what that might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the intervention that's talks about a lot is counter-speech. And counter-speech can vary. So some people have used bots. So as soon as you send a hateful tweet, this bot will tweet at you and say, do you really think you should be saying that online? Turns out that's a very crude way of doing things. Sometimes that leads people to reevaluate their behavior. Other times it actually makes them go, like, who are you to tell me what to do? Actually, and they get even worse. But I think counter-speech is a very useful tactic that we can use, and lots of the social media platforms are now trying to put their weight behind that. I think there could be other things we could do. It could be about adjusting the informational environment that people have online. Maybe we see that they're slowly embedding themselves in more extremist conversations and communities online, and there could be a step there to say maybe we curate their content slightly differently. That also has a lot of ethical concerns around the manipulation of the social media environment. So, and again, there's no simple answer here. And I think the key thing is that we need some studies to actually evidence what works.
So we have time for one more question. Ha, he would be right at the back.
Hello. So unfortunately, I didn't get to see the whole speech, but I hear you talking about hate speech, and I just wanted to know, how would you define that in an algorithmic way, and would it actually be beneficial to try and censor people's conversations online before they've even said their piece?
So what do you mean by in an algorithmic way?
Well, so you're talking about like identifying toxic behavior online. So how do you do that? How does who defines what is toxic?
Well, so we used a definition for the purposes of our research, which was based around indiscriminate negativity against Muslims and Islam. And that was very appropriate for our research. I don't think that should be used to moderate speech online in general. I think the implications of that for freedom of speech would be quite diabolical. Especially as we had an idea of weak Islamophobia, which was kind of implicit comments. So I mean, it is an important question. Who gets to define what hate speech is? And that's something which definitely needs more work.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the importance of doing research into it and to try and understand it better is helped by remembering the point that at the moment it's the platforms that decide what is hate speech in large number. And they do that, not only do they do that in a non-transparent way, but they also do it in a way, they don't really care kind of why it's there or how to stop it getting there in the first place. They just want it off their platforms because they're violating their community standards. And that leaves a kind of a gap in terms of actually trying to understand what's going on and kind of, have a more curative or preventative approach rather than just dealing with it there. I mean, I don't know if you said you came later. I mean, I was saying earlier that Facebook took down over 500 million accounts in the first quarter of last year. You know, that is a huge amount. It's good that we know that they did that, but we don't know what it was. There's a lot of information there that has been lost to this kind of research.
Okay, we'll close it there. This has been a rich and stimulating session in a full day of rich and stimulating sessions. So I'd certainly like to thank you. We have another day, equally promising tomorrow, more around data science and public policy, some around data science and the financial sector, and then the head of UK research and innovation, Smart Warpert, here with the Alan Turing Institute's chief executive tomorrow, talking about the future and the importance of research in the UK. So you've given us a very strong platform for a final day. I'd like to thank you immensely for this evening's session and ask you please as an audience to show your appreciation too with a round of applause.